The Hayes cottage sat at the very end of Willow Lane, a little stone house with faded shutters and a roof. George Hayes had patched himself more times than Margaret could count, but no one came to admire the house. They came for the garden. Behind the cottage stretched an oasis of color and life. Rows of roses in every shade climbed the trellises along the fence. Lavender bushes perfumed the air, buzzing with bees. Tomatoes, cucumbers, and beans filled raised beds, while strawberries spread like cheerful red freckles near the back gate. Beyond that, Margaret had coaxed sunflowers so tall that children would crane their necks just to count their golden heads. For Margaret, the garden wasn't just plants. It was memory. She could still see George kneeling in the dirt beside her 40 years ago, his big hands clumsy, but careful as he pressed the first seeds into the soil. "We'll build something that outlives us, Maggie," he'd said with that crooked smile. And he had been right. Though George was gone now, every leaf and bloom seemed to carry his voice. On warm afternoons, the neighborhood children wandered through the open gate as if the garden belonged to them too. Little Emma from next door loved to help pick strawberries, her hands stained red as she giggled. The Johnson twins chased butterflies among the marigolds, while their mother leaned on the fence, chatting with Margaret. Even the older folks found peace here. Mr. Green, widowed like Margaret, often sat on the old wooden bench by the roses, saying the scent reminded him of his late wife's perfume. The pastor sometimes stopped by after evening services, just to walk the rows in silence. Margaret herself found her greatest comfort here. When loneliness pressed too heavily inside the quiet house, she came out to the garden. Kneeling in the soil, pulling weeds, or simply brushing her hand over the petals of her roses, she felt close to George again. The garden gave her a reason to rise each morning, to greet the day, to keep living. But not everyone saw beauty in it. From over the fence came a voice one afternoon, sharp and clipped. "Margaret, don't you think this is all a bit much?" Margaret looked up from where she was tying beanstalks to their poles. Standing at the fence line was her new neighbor, Karen Whitfield. Perfectly coiffed, sunglasses perched on her nose, Karen's lips curved in a frown as she surveyed the garden. I I beg your pardon?" Margaret asked softly, wiping her hands on her apron. Karen gestured toward the vegetable beds with a dismissive wave. "All this, the rows of produce, the wildflowers, it looks messy. This is a residential neighborhood, not a farm. People like uniformity, order, neatly trimmed lawns, maybe a rose bush or two. But this, it drags the whole place down." Margaret's heart skipped. She pressed her hands together, steadying her voice. "This garden has been here for decades. My husband and I planted it together. It's my home." Karen sniffed, pulling her sunglasses higher. "Well, times change. Standards change. Some of us care about property values." She paused, a thin smile spreading across her face. "You'll see. The HOA doesn't take kindly to clutter." With that, she turned and strutted back to her pristine yard, where not a blade of grass was out of place. Margaret stood frozen, the hum of bees filling the silence. She looked back at her garden, her roses, her vegetables, her sunflowers, glowing in the late sun. To her, it was life. To Karen, it was an eyesore. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a shadow creep into her sanctuary. The garden still bloomed, but peace on Willow Lane had begun to wither. The letter came on a gray Tuesday morning. Margaret opened her mailbox, expecting bills and a catalog or two, but instead found a stark white envelope stamped with the HOA seal. The bold print on the front read, "Notice of violation." Her hands shook as she carried it back into the house. Sitting at her kitchen table, she slit the envelope open with a butter knife. The words inside cut deeper than any blade. Unapproved landscaping. Remove non-conforming garden structures immediately, or face fines. Deadline: 14 days. Margaret's breath caught. 14 days? Remove her garden? The garden she and George had built with their own hands? She pressed the paper flat on the table, her tears spotting the ink. She stepped outside into the sunlight, clutching the letter. The garden stretched before her, alive and defiant, roses blooming, strawberries glowing red in their patches. How could they call this a violation? Her neighbor Elena spotted her from across the fence. Mrs. Hayes, you all right? Margaret forced a smile. Just a letter. The HOA doesn't like my garden? Elena frowned. That's ridiculous. Everyone here loves your garden. My kids practically live in it. Before Margaret could reply, the sound of heels clicked against the pavement. Karen Whitfield appeared at the edge of the property, clipboard in hand, lips curled in a smug smile. I see you got our notice, she said coolly. Good. Best to take care of these things quickly. Margaret straightened, her voice trembling but firm. Karen, this garden has been here for decades. It's not hurting anyone. Karen adjusted her sunglasses. It hurts property values, Margaret. Buyers don't want to see vegetables and weeds spilling into sight. Lawns and hedges are tidy. This, she gestured at the sprawling blooms, is chaos. If you don't clear it, the fines will only get worse. Margaret's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. This garden is all I have left of my husband. Every flower, every vine, it's his memory. You can't just erase that. Karen tilted her head, voice dripping with false sweetness. Oh, Margaret, don't be so dramatic. So, rules are rules. With that, she turned and walked briskly back toward her manicured yard, leaving Margaret standing among her flowers, clutching the letter like a death notice. That evening, she wandered through the rows, trailing her fingers over petals George had once tended. She whispered into the quiet air, What am I supposed to do, George? They want to take it all away. The garden swayed gently in the breeze, as if answering, Hold on. But Margaret didn't yet know how hard the fight would become. The letters didn't stop. 2 weeks after the first notice, another envelope arrived. Then another. Each one harsher than the last. Second violation. $250 fine for non-compliance. Final warning. $500 fine. Immediate removal of unapproved garden required. Margaret stacked them neatly on her kitchen table, but the pile grew taller every week until it seemed to tower over her. She would sit there at night with a cup of tea, growing cold in her hands, staring at the stamped seals and the bold words, Final notice. Her heart ached. She lived on a fixed income, her late husband's pension, and a little savings. She couldn't afford hundreds of dollars in fines. But more than the money, it was the principle. How could anyone fine her for the soil she had tended for 40 years? One afternoon, she stood in her garden, tying up a row of tomato vines, when Elena came rushing through the gate, her face red with anger. Mrs. Hayes, you need to see this. Margaret followed her to the front fence. Spray-painted across the wooden boards, in dripping red letters, were 2 words. Close it. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. She staggered back, tears welling in her eyes. Who would do this? Elena's jaw tightened. Who do you think? Karen's been whipping people up, telling them the garden is an embarrassment. Looks like someone decided to send you a message. Margaret pressed her hand against the rough wood, her shoulders shaking. George built this fence. He painted it with our children one summer. And now, her voice broke. Elena put an arm around her. You're not alone in this, Margaret. Don't forget that. But the harassment didn't stop at letters and graffiti. One morning, Margaret woke to find a man in a neon vest walking through her yard with a clipboard. I'm with the city inspector's office, he explained flatly. We've had complaints about your landscaping attracting pests. Pests? Margaret repeated, her voice incredulous. These are roses and vegetables, not trash. The man shrugged. Just following up. But if we find violations, you'll need to clear it. Margaret's chest tightened. And if you don't find any? He didn't answer. He just scribbled something and left. That evening, Margaret sat on her porch, staring out at her beloved rose. For the first time in years, the garden felt less like a sanctuary and more like a target. Her hands trembled as she whispered into the dusk, George, I don't know how much longer I can fight them. Just then, Elena appeared again, carrying a basket of fresh bread. Behind her came Mr. Green with his cane, and then 2 more neighbors. They didn't speak right away. They just sat with her on the porch, quiet and steady. the way friends do when words aren't enough. Finally, Mr. Green broke the silence. They want you to give up, Margaret, but you won't. Not while we're here. For the first time in days, Margaret managed a faint smile. Perhaps she wasn't as powerless as she felt. Still, the battle was far from over. It started small. On a Saturday morning, Elena and her two children stood outside Margaret's gate with hand-painted signs that read, "Save the garden" and "Hands off Mrs. Hayes's roses." By noon, a dozen neighbors had joined them. By evening, the entire sidewalk was filled. Parents, children, retirees, and even strangers from across town who had heard the story. Some carried flowers, others brought baskets of produce from Margaret's own garden to hand out. Laughter and cheers mixed with the chants that echoed down Willow Lane. "Save the garden! Save the garden!" Margaret stood on her porch, overwhelmed. She clutched the railing, her heart swelling as she saw her garden defended not just by her hands, but by the community she had quietly nurtured for decades. Tears blurred her vision when she spotted Mr. Green, leaning heavily on his cane, but holding a sign that read, "This garden heals." Children skipped among the rows, offering strawberries to newcomers. A local musician pulled out his guitar and began strumming softly. What Karen had called an eyesore was now the beating heart of the neighborhood. But then, Karen herself stormed down the street. Her heels clacked like gunshots, her pearl necklace bouncing against her chest as her fury carried her forward. "This is illegal," she shouted, waving her clipboard like a sword. "You can't block the street. You can't gather here without a permit. You're disrupting the peace." The sheriff's cruiser rolled up slowly, lights flashing lazily. Sheriff Collins stepped out, a calm, heavy-set man with years of authority in his voice. He surveyed the crowd, then Karen. "Evening, folks," he said. "Everything all right here?" Karen thrust her finger toward the crowd. "No, it's not all right. These people are trespassing and disturbing the neighborhood. You need to shut this down, Sheriff." The sheriff glanced at the families holding flowers, at the children laughing, at the handmade signs. Then he looked back at Karen, his tone steady. "Ma'am, they're on public property. Peaceful assembly isn't against the law." Karen's face went crimson. "Peaceful? They're chanting. They're mocking me. This is harassment." From the crowd, Elena called out, "No, Karen. What you're doing to Margaret is harassment." The neighbors cheered, the chant growing louder. Margaret finally stepped down from her porch, her voice soft but carrying. "Please, everyone, thank you. I don't know how to repay this kindness." The sheriff tipped his hat. "You don't need to, ma'am. Sometimes a town remembers what matters most. Looks like they just did." Karen's hands shook as she clutched her clipboard tighter. She opened her mouth to retort, but the cheers drowned her out. "Let the garden grow! Let the garden grow!" For the first time, Margaret realized the fight was no longer hers alone. The garden had become a symbol, not just of memory, but of community defying cruelty. And Karen, once so confident, suddenly looked very small, standing against an entire town. The county courthouse had never seen such a crowd. By the time the bailiff called order, the gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder, neighbors, townsfolk, reporters with notepads ready. The garden trial, as people had begun calling it, had become the talk of the county. At the plaintiff's table sat Karen Whitfield, pearls glinting under the lights, her expression one of cool triumph. Beside her was the HOA's attorney, a sharp-featured man in a tailored suit, his briefcase stuffed with bylaws and citations. Across the aisle, Margaret sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her dress neat but plain. Elena sat just behind her, with half the town filling the benches beyond. Rachel Porter, the young lawyer who had stepped up to help Margaret pro bono, leaned close and whispered, "You're not alone, Mrs. Hayes. Remember that." "All rise," the bailiff commanded. Judge Ramirez entered, his robe flowing, his face stern but not unkind. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and nodded. "Proceed." Karen's attorney strode forward first. "Your Honor, this case is simple. Mrs. Hayes's so-called garden violates community aesthetic standards. It is overgrown, unapproved, and disruptive to the neighborhood's appearance. We have multiple complaints, photographs of the so-called landscaping, and documented finds. He gestured to the stack of papers. If one resident is allowed to flaunt the rules, Your Honor, what prevents others from turning their properties into unregulated eyesores? We must maintain order. Karen's lips curled into a smug smile, her eyes flashing at Margaret like knives. Then it was Rachel's turn. She rose, her voice steady. Your Honor, this case is not about order. It is about community, memory, and rights. Mrs. Hayes has tended her garden for nearly 40 years. It is not a nuisance. It is a landmark of love and tradition. The HOA's claim that it is disruptive is not only baseless, it is cruel. She turned, gesturing to the packed gallery. The half the town is here today because they know the truth. Margaret's garden feeds families, teaches children, comforts the lonely. It is not weeds, it is roots. Roots of history, of belonging. Judge Ramirez raised a hand. We will hear testimony. And so they did. Elena took the stand first. My children learned to plant their first seeds in Mrs. Hayes's garden. They know where food comes from because of her. That garden is a gift, not a nuisance. Next came Mr. Green. His voice cracked with age, but rang clear with truth. After my wife passed, I thought I'd never smile again. But I sat in that garden, smelled those roses, and for the first time in months, I felt peace. That garden saved me. Even Pastor Williams testified, it is rare in this world to find a place that heals both body and soul. Margaret's garden is one such place. By the time they finished, the gallery was in tears. Finally, Judge Ramirez turned to Margaret. Mrs. Hayes, do you wish to speak? Margaret rose slowly, her hands trembling, but her eyes shone with quiet strength. Your Honor, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a woman who loved her husband. We built this garden together. Every flower I touch, I remember him. Every vine I tend, I feel less alone. And I've shared it freely, with neighbors, with children, with anyone who needed it. If that breaks rules, then perhaps the rules are broken. The room fell utterly silent. Even Karen's attorney looked unsettled. Karen, however, could not hold her tongue. She shot to her feet, shouting, It doesn't matter what it means to her. Rules are rules. Enough, Mrs. Whitfield, Judge Ramirez thundered, his gavel slamming down. Crack. You will not interrupt this court again. Karen sat, fuming, her face red. Rachel placed a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder as she sat back down. The gallery stirred, whispers passing like waves. The judge's face was unreadable, but his eyes softened as he glanced at Margaret. The court will issue its decision tomorrow morning. The gavel fell once more. Crack. Margaret exhaled, exhausted but proud. She had spoken her truth. And now, the whole town had heard it. The courthouse was even more crowded the next morning. People stood shoulder to shoulder in the hallway, spilling into the aisles of the courtroom itself. The garden trial had become the biggest event the town had seen in years. Reporters sat with their pens poised, children fidgeted in their seats, and Margaret Hayes sat quietly at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Karen Whitfield was already there, her pearl necklace gleaming, her face tight with anticipation. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering, It's already done. No judge would side with a widow's weeds. But when Judge Ramirez entered and called the court to order, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. He adjusted his glasses and began. I have listened carefully to the testimony presented by both sides. The HOA has argued that Mrs. Hayes's garden violates aesthetic standards and diminishes property values. But the evidence shows otherwise. I heard from residents, from community members, from leaders of this town, and all agree the garden is not a nuisance. It is a community treasure. Margaret's heart pounded. She gripped the edge of the table as the judge continued. This court finds that the HOA has engaged in harassment, issuing baseless fines, and attempting to erase something of deep cultural and personal value. The bylaws cited do not and cannot justify the destruction of a long-standing garden that predates the HOA itself. He raised his gavel, his voice firm. This court rules in favor of Margaret Hayes. The garden stays. All fines are null and void. The HOA is hereby ordered to cease its interference immediately. Crack! The gavel came down like thunder. For a split second, silence held the room. Then, the gallery erupted. Cheers, applause, even tears. Children clapped their hands, neighbors hugged one another, and the sound filled the chamber like a wave of triumph. Graceful but stunned, Margaret covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Elena wrapped her arms around her. "You did it, Mrs. Hayes. You won!" Karen shot to her feet, face crimson. "This is outrageous. You can't. This is going to ruin everything. My neighborhood, my rules." "Sit down, Mrs. Whitfield," Judge Ramirez said sharply, gavel slamming again. "One more outburst, and I'll hold you in contempt." Karen's attorney tugged at her sleeve, hissing, "Stop!" But she yanked away, fuming, her whole plan unraveling in front of the town she had once commanded. Margaret stood slowly, leaning on the table for support. She looked toward the judge, her voice breaking. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge nodded kindly. "Mrs. Hayes, this community owes you thanks. Your garden has given them more than flowers. It has given them roots." The crowd erupted once more as Margaret left the courtroom, her neighbors gathering around her, lifting her up as though she were their champion. For the first time in months, her steps felt light. The battle was over, and the garden had won. The morning after the verdict, Margaret stepped out onto her porch with a watering can in hand. The air felt different, lighter, freer. Sunlight spilled over the rows of flowers and vegetables, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel the weight of fear pressing on her chest. The garden was safe. But what she hadn't expected was what came next. By noon, neighbors began arriving. First Elena with her children carrying packets of seeds, then Mr. Green with his cane and a bag of mulch. Soon families filled the yard, offering tools, wood for new raised beds, even benches to place under the shade trees. "Mrs. Hayes," Elena said with a smile, "you've given us so much with this garden. Now it's our turn to help you." Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears as she watched children kneel in the soil, planting bright marigolds alongside her roses. Parents pulled weeds and built trellises. Laughter filled the air, mixing with the hum of bees and the rustle of leaves. By evening, the garden no longer belonged to Margaret alone. It belonged to everyone. A new wooden sign was hammered into the ground at the gate, painted by local kids in bright colors. "Hayes Community Garden, where love grows." Margaret stood before it, her hands trembling as she traced the letters. She whispered softly, "George, we did it. The garden's alive. And so am I." The weeks that followed turned the once quiet patch of earth into the town's gathering place. Children learned to plant and harvest, families held picnics among the rows, and elderly neighbors came to rest on the benches, soaking in the peace. Even the local school began visiting, using the garden as a living classroom. And Karen? She kept her distance. Stripped of her power, she could only watch from her pristine porch as the eyesore she'd tried to destroy became the pride of the community. One summer evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange, Margaret sat on the old bench by the roses. Children's laughter floated through the air, fireflies blinked above the bean rows, and neighbors lingered, talking and smiling among the blooms. The widow closed her eyes, her heart full. The garden had started as her private sanctuary, a way to keep her husband's memory alive. But now it had grown into something bigger, an anchor for the town, a reminder that love once planted could never truly be uprooted. Karen had tried to close it. Instead, she had helped it bloom brighter than ever.